Uranium is going to be strong. Gold is going to be strong. Silver could potentially see one of the biggest rises. It could be the next great bubble, probably after uranium. But I think by 2030, I think you want to hold on to your silver. Let's just put it that way. I thought silver was going to rise when inflation spiked, and it's the exact opposite. So a little egg on my face for that. But there's a couple things going on. A lot of macro forces are aligned for it, but a couple are not. And those are the things that have been the barrier. The biggest one, I'm sure your audience knows, is the U.S. dollar and the strength of the U.S. dollar, or strength of the U.S. dollar, right? And the spike that it's had, gold and silver are priced universally in U.S. dollars, and so the higher it goes, the stronger the barrier against them rising. And so that's been part of it. It all got kickstarted because of the sell everything environment, right? Real yields are changing, and the Fed most recently has been very clear in stating they're going to be very aggressive, more than I think a lot of people thought, in raising rates, and that makes the mainstream investor and institutional crowd outside of gold and silver that don't understand it's the real yield that impacts things. That makes them, want to sell gold and silver because rates are going to rise, and that's not good for gold and silver. So I think a combination of those factors is what's been playing into it. But of course, I think that is going to change. I've documented very clearly that gold and silver cycle, and after a down cycle, next is an up cycle. So I think that's what's coming. The only thing we don't know is the timing. If your expectations are here and something over here happens instead, that can destroy your faith in the investment, when actually maybe it was your expectation that was wrong and not the investment. And I think that's exactly what we have in the case with silver. So, the point I wanted to get across at Silver Symposium that I spoke at was that, look, silver's DNA is very clear. If you go back 50 plus years, you look at its price behavior, it's boring. It does nothing. It goes sideways. It's weak. And even many times when other investors at other times thought it should be rising, it didn't. It's boring, and then all of a sudden what happens? There's this, sudden, almost violent spike where it just comes out of nowhere, catches many people off guard, and goes on this huge run, on average more than doubling during those spikes. So silver's DNA is boring, boom. We're obviously in the boring phase. But what I did is I went back and looked at all of those spikes, and I looked at the time period between each of them, and I measured them, and I documented them in a report. And what I found was that those boring times are measured in years. They're not measured in months. And in many of those cases, during the boring phase, it's true. There were a lot of people wondering, why isn't silver reacting? Back in the 90s, back in 2000, after 9/11, back in even the mid-1970s, silver fell, and that was right after gold was, became legal again to own in the U.S., inflation was soaring, and yet silver fell. So we've seen this before. Anyway, if you average all those time periods between the spikes, and you take out the two bear markets, the real long bear markets in the 90s and one in the 80s, if you take those out, the average time between the spikes is 2 years and 7 months. This has nothing to do with fundamentals. This is strictly just historical price behavior, right? 2 years and 7 months. When was our last spike? It's almost exactly 2 years ago. So I think 2023 could be very interesting for silver. So to answer your question, that's the expectation. If we know that's the expectation, even though we thought silver was going to rise during inflation, but if the expectation is, look, there's long periods of boring, and sometimes it doesn't react to the catalysts we think it should. Historically, it has not always reacted to the catalysts we thought it should. If that's your expectation, you understand that, then you realize, hey, silver's not a bad investment. We need to change our expectation, look at what is more realistic in terms of its historical price behavior. So I personally think next year could be very interesting, and that's based on historical price behavior, but also some key fundamentals I think will play out here in the near future. Two things. One is investment demand. Now, retail investment demand is okay. It's reasonably strong, but it's not really dramatically rising. And the number one factor that impacts the price of silver, believe it or not, is investment demand, especially for physical investment demand. And the reason is because industrial demand stays pretty constant. It's going to rise over time. Jewelry demand stays pretty constant, tends to rise over time.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The big thing that varies is investment. When investment demand is down or low, the silver price tends not to react. When investment demand is high, silver does tend to react and go into a spike. So that's a key factor. So what I'm saying is watch next year for investment demand to shift from being okay, relatively average, basically. In some cases, it's weak, and especially ETF demand. But next year, I think that changes, and that could be, a spark. So, and the other issue is industrial demand. I think industrial demand, what I tried to point out in that talk was that I think it's going to be greater than a lot of people think. It hasn't really kicked in yet, and solar demand is going to be dramatically higher, I think, than a lot of people realize. One example, they're already using double-sided solar panels in China, so they can capture, morning sun, and then they can rotate it and capture afternoon sun. So some companies are starting to use multi-layered solar panels. So it's not just the top layer of paste that is on there, but a multi-layered one, so they can capture even more power from the sun. So there's a lot of things happening like that. The U.S., as you point out, wants to green the grid too, right? So I think there's going to be a substantial jump in demand for silver for industrial reasons over the next year or two. We're going to see a big jump in that coming in the next year or two. So I still think this is pretty bold to say, but I still think silver is probably going to be the trade of the decade. Uranium is going to be strong. Gold is going to be strong. Silver could potentially see one of the biggest rises. It could be the next great bubble, probably after uranium. But I think by 2030, I think you want to hold on to your silver. Let's just put it that way.